All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Clark Burnett. I'm the manager of culture and museums here at the city of Niagara Falls. I'd just like to welcome you for today's program. As we do all of our programs, we will begin with a land acknowledgement to recognize the land in which we share with all peoples before we move into our program. So the Niagara region of Ontario is located on a traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Chinatan peoples. The Chinatan people have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have been sharing the land as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. In our steps to reconcile with the past and assist in the ongoing education of the Niagara Falls community, the team here at Niagara Falls Museums and the Culture Division of the City of Niagara Falls has attempted to work with local Indigenous community in telling the stories of the past, the present, and is working with them on the future as best we can. We've presented programs for young and old, held exhibitions, and done many workshops. But in our field, we also know that there's always more to the story. There's deeper stories that we can tell and important stories that we must tell. That people's stories are deep and that a collective history is not always shared, and that there are many ways to look at the history in this community. We hope you learned something today, that you share what you learn with somebody, and that you continue on the path of understanding all the stories of our friends, our neighbors, and those of whom you haven't met yet. In honor of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, we'll take a look at our collective past to find inspiration and practices that might help us build constructive relationships with our Indigenous neighbors. The residential school survivors and their descendants, the victims of the 60s soup and children who grew up away from their home community, are trying to rebuild their Indigenous identity and sense of self. Colonization has damaged Indigenous identity, connection to place, and cultural continuity. Yet the Indigenous resilience and strength is shining through, and today our presenter will examine the current social, cultural, and educational movements to bring back what was nearly lost. I just have a quick word on housekeeping. We have the chat open and available to you if you want to use it, but there is also a Q&A section in this session. And we'll be monitoring the Q&A section, mostly during this Zoom webinar. And you can post your questions there, and we'll do our best to cover all or most of them. However, we will save the questions for the end. But if you have something you want to ask, don't be afraid to put in the Q&A section early. Don't wait till the end. And I will save those up and ask Rick at the end of this session. Now, enough for me. Let me turn it over to our presenter. Richard Hill is a Tuscarora citizen of the Haudenosaunee, a confederation of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora Nations. He has been responsible for recovery of wampum belts from museums and historical societies, uncovering the history they carry, and sharing these teachings so that the lessons of history are not forgotten. He has worked for the National Museum of the American Indian, the State University of New York at Buffalo, Nations Polytechnic, and now is the Indigenous Innovations Specialist at Mohawk College in Hamilton. In recognition of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, the Niagara Falls Museums is honored to partner with Richard Hill again. We value every time we speak with him and work with him and what he allows us to share with our community. And he's going to bring an engaging conversation, as always, surrounding Indigenous history on this significant day. So again, once again, Rick, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Clark. I appreciate this invitation to come. Clark, we've become great allies and re-looking at history from both Indigenous and settler eyes to uncover the things that have been really ignored or left behind. Today, I'm going to explore our connections to place, but let me start by saying Chwant Askanahe. That's an old Tuscarora greeting that basically says, I kind of hope you're still at peace. Peace is a hard thing to come by today, but let's get to the PowerPoint and then we'll get to the questions from there. So I'm going to get this up on my screen here. And I'm going to go through this as best I can. Every time you go anywhere where Indigenous people are, they ask you where you're from. What they're really saying is kind of like, well, who are your people? So even when we go from one Haudenosaunee community to another, they want to know that. Who are your people? They're talking about who's your clan? What is your ancestry? What's your descendancy? A long time ago, when we would gather, when we greet somebody, you'd actually ask them, what kind of clay are you made from? And their reference would be, let's just say, so I'm a Tuscarora of the Beaver Clan. I'm from the Beaver Clan kind of place, and that connects us to the earth and to our ancestral location. But to tell you the truth, I've been at the center of the universe many times, all across different Native communities. I've visited across North America. They always said, here's where everything began. Here's where humans were first born. Here's where our tradition started. And here's where our destiny lies. And I think that's important to realize, that our sense of place defines who we are. I've been to the Black Hills in the Dakotas and met with the Lakota people there who consider them to be sacred. And all throughout the Black Hills, you can see these offerings that they leave there. They're connecting to both the spirit of the place and the memory of their ancestors about that place. But you know what? The place holds memories as well. And part of that memory is kind of strange. You go to the Black Hills and all of a sudden you go to Mount Rushmore. And here's all of these presidents who I think did some great things and maybe not so great things, but their image is etched into the actual landscape, almost overriding that of the original Native people. So we're always caught in this kind of juxtaposition between an American and a Canadian master narrative and the Indigenous narrative of that particular place. But the Lakota people are still there. They're still dancing on the sacred earth. They're still maintaining their traditions, their language. They're struggling at times economically, but that thing that Clark talked about, there's something inside of them, that fire that burns, that connects them to that place, is still alive. I've also been to Haida Gwaii out in British Columbia, heard the stories from the Haidas on how one time Raven came and opened up this clamshell and these 7 human figures tumbled out and went around and populated the landscape. We met every morning at this rock for our sunrise ceremonies. Our traditions still brought together at a single place, but it's also important to know the Haidas have had to recover their cultural expressions. A lot of what they produced in the past was either removed by missionaries or then anthropologists or collectors, locked away in museums far away. Well, since the 70s, the Haidas have been recovering that tradition, carving new totem poles, poles of identity and belief. Then this particular one called the Watchmen, that stand guard over their communities and greet the visitors to that. So it's great when you see this. So we can say a lot of great treasures were locked up in the museums, but the creativity of our people is still there to produce new ones. When I was there, I met this young man. His name was Cujo, the guy on the right. They were leading the protest against the timbering companies who were trying to cut all those great trees down. And they considered the trees to be their ancestors, their true watchmen. And like all things, he spent his whole life there in that community and in service to the people. They eventually made him the chief of their community. And now we see him as an old man, like I've become, wearing those symbols of identity and of pride and of spirit and connection. And so that's quite a transformation that we see in our young people all across our land. I've also been to the Southwest working with the Hopi and the Pueblo people. Their old structures still survive. Centuries old. In this case, this ancient kiva, this circular space. They believe there was another world in which those beings emerged from to come up into this world, that place of emergence, they call that. So they tell us the stories about what took place there. But they also continue. So the Hopis are really amazing people. They continue their ceremonies that we can see here on the right, but they're also working very hard to retain their language with their people. And I see this all across North America. The people are working every day to try to bring their minds together to create a new sense of culture, a new sense of community, a new sense of belonging, because we needed that. And I grew up, and none of this was a part of my family experience. And so we had to recover that. My daughter married a Hopi and they had 4 children. This is my oldest grandson, Jaron. He's a model and an actor. I hope he doesn't smoke regularly, but in this particular ad, we see him there. But I was quite struck when I read his words online: hard work, dedication, and family. He said, these are the values that drives his experience. He grew up mostly in Arizona with his Hopi family. He'd come back to Tuscarora now and then, but he says, we work and persist to provide for those that we love, but also we do these things for the benefit of everybody. He said it's like a ripple effect. So what we do today can impact those future generations. And what we do today isn't just about recovering the ancient knowledge and life ways, but it's about how to exist in this world in a meaningful way. I've also been to Hawaii and heard the stories from the native Hawaiians about this ancient contest between the spirit of the volcano and the spirit of the lush valleys. And that because of the volcanic action, it produces this mist that sweeps across the land that kind of revitalizes everything. This is really a symbol of what we're trying to do today. How do we revitalize the land, the people in the land, those ancestral spirits, and how do we make sure that the fertility of our lives is going to continue, so that our culture's going to grow. It's not going to be frozen in the past. The Native Hawaiians have been really leading and developing their own educational institutions. They're retain their knowledge, their culture, and their beliefs. And they've been instrumental in helping the rest of the Indigenous world get inspired about techniques of learning how to teach the language to young people who maybe didn't grow up speaking the language. This young woman here is a kind of a symbol of that, where she's learned about her culture and her traditions and her background and her identity, and her connection to her place is so strong. At the same time, she's also becoming a scientist and looking at environmental sciences. She looks at, by traditional background, it's the foundation for which is going to lead to employment to help protect all of that one way or another. So in many ways, Indigenous people are like corn. Many different kinds, different colors, different shapes, different varieties of corn that have grown up over the centuries, but also from a particular place. When I was in Arizona and meet with the Hopis, I was amazed to see them growing their corn in the desert. You can see how far apart they've had to learn how to plant it. They still plant in these small mounds. Corn doesn't grow really tall, but they produce corn to feed themselves, with a profound connection to all of that natural ecology, to all of the unseen spirits there, but they do it because that's what they were taught to do. They keep planting corn season after season, and that corn becomes the metaphor for their lives. On the other hand, if you visit the Mayan communities in Mexico and Central America, they live in these lush valleys, and they have a different style of planting corn and many different varieties of corn. So what I'm getting at here is that corn then is also place-based. Not every Indigenous society grows corn, but here among the Onondagas, we are the people of the corn, meaning that that connection is so important to our lives. We have 15 different kinds of corn, probably about 50 different kinds of beans, and several different kinds of squash. So what our young people are doing is returning to that garden, returning to the power of that seed in order to revitalize not only their physical health, but their mental and their spiritual health as well. So who would have thought that tiny little corn seed could lead to this revolution in overcoming the trauma of colonization? So of the corn growing people, they all have a distinctive variety that only grows well in their place. So think of it this way, that corn seed, this is corn seed from Cherokees in North Carolina. It has the memory of generations of Cherokees planting, cultivating, singing, harvesting, preparing that particular kind of corn. There's a relationship to them. Corn really is one of their relatives, and it grows well in the Cherokee place. What we're taught as the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse, is that this world was created on the back of a turtle, and the whole universe is like an extended family. And the earth is our mother. Excuse me. The moon is our grandmother. The sun is our brother. The thundering thunder beings are like our grandfathers. And the stars are all of our relatives who pass from this world. And then we have these three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, that grow there. So there's a whole story attached to all of this, as you can imagine, but it connects us to this particular place. So I think that's important to remember, is that we don't require scientific proof that this is true. This is what you hear growing up. This is what connects you to that place. And you take it on faith that what your ancestors knew is good, is time-tested and true. Something disrupted all of that, and that was the residential schools, in this case, the Mohawk Institute, what really is the oldest residential school in Canada, originally started in 1828. I think it became a residential school by 1840s. As we can see in this photograph here, They tried to militarize our kids. They tried to take away all of that stuff that I talked about, that identity, that connection to place, connection to family. They put kids in school and wouldn't let them go home. And so the whole idea of that style of education was to transform the child, to get them away from their tradition, their culture, really even to get them away from their land. And I have to tell you, they almost succeeded. I'm of the generation, we grew up speaking in English because that was the intent of this particular school. But the kids who went there, you imagine what it'd be like to, an officer shows up at your door, or the Indian agent or the local priest, and takes you in this big limousine to the residential school, where it becomes your new home. In fact, they even said that, I now am your father. This is your new family. And they isolated the kids so much that when they did bring them back to the community, as in this case here, 1934, these are boys going to the Mohawk Institute. They came to the Ashwegan Fair, which is in the fall of the year. They were strangers to their own community. And the community looked at them kind of funny. They were, those were those schoolboys over there. That disconnect happens quite quickly and quite profoundly. But some of the students there etched into the bricks of the Mohawk Institute messages for us. In this case here, you can see Frank served time here, 11 years too many. And a lot of them put their names on there. They wanted people to remember, I went to school here. This is where I was. But can you imagine being in a school for 11 years and perhaps not seeing your family? So I had to learn a lot about this story from the survivors. I worked with trying to develop an exhibition plan for the Mohawk Institute. Instrumental in my learning was this woman here, Roberta Hill. I don't know if we're related directly, but it's a picture of her after she got out of the school, but the stories that she told. And what she said was, it didn't just happen to us, but then there's this intergenerational trauma. We took our trauma, and then when we raised our kids, we inadvertently passed it on to them because, she said we had no loving models there. Nobody treated us humanely. And so when you grow up that way, that's what you think you're supposed to do. And it took her a long time in her own life to get past all of that. But one thing she said is what helped her recover her sanity is her connection to community and the importance of a culture, and seeing the young people now kind of standing up and revitalizing their connection to their ancestral place. And survivor after survivor say the same thing. This is Geronimo Henry. Here's one fellow who did spend 11 years in that school, never went home, never saw his mother for 11 years, no birthdays, no Christmas, no parties. And as a result of that, when he did finally get out of the school, he felt a stranger. And he was estranged from his cousins and relatives, and unfortunately fell into drinking, because one of the consequences of this kind of thing is that people lose the sense of themselves. They become rootless, hopeless. And unfortunately, many of them didn't survive. But now Geronimo is back to remind us about that. He said every time he tells his story, he heals a little bit. And it's important what's happened with the Truth and Reconciliation, that we're hearing these stories. We're getting to understand what happens to real people in places like this. Another fellow that I interviewed and had a big impact on me is this man here. His name is John Elliott. It's a picture of him when he was at the school. He was a kid. He went to school, and him and his brother decided to run away the first day they were there. They said, they're going back home in the community. All of a sudden, they're at this place, and they ran away. But unfortunately, they got caught, got taken back. He ran away again. I dare say John Elliott holds the record for running away from the Mohawk Institute more than any other student. He ran away so much that finally they just gave up on him. They just stopped looking for him. But the stories are told about how he was beaten and disciplined there, and denied food, all of the things you can imagine in like a prison camp for the kids. But he's there. He's still there to share that story. Remember what I said about the land holding the memory? Now the survivors hold this memory, and they're sharing it with us. The school holds the memory. I dare say even the trees and the fields around there hold the memory of what took place, but that doesn't have to be the destiny. Like all memories, it's something that did happen. What we're going to make happen will become the new memories for the new generation. I met this woman, Geraldine, and I have to tell you, it was quite moving to hear her story. She was a scrawny little girl when she got there, and she talked about from the first day she had to have a fight. It was almost like a rite of initiation. Whether you liked it or not, people are going to fight and steal. So it was kids committing oppression on other kids. That was the system. That's what they did. And but she survived, even though she was fearful every day of being beat up or molested by the officers there at the school. She got through it. And what she decided was, this is no way to raise children. Children shouldn't have to put up with this. And so she spent her life after that going around and advocating for a whole new attitude, a whole new look. She passed away last year, and so her passing is quite sad, except the fact that her message will live forever. She has had a profound impact now on getting people to understand what really took place here. So her individual resiliency, the thing that Clark talked about, shone through. She didn't have a lot of tradition and a lot of language and culture that she carried into it. But since she got out, she realized the connection, how that connection is so important. And so it was ironic that the place that the Pope chose to meet Indigenous people, as he was here to apologize for the residential schools, of this place here, Lake Saint Anne. It's considered a healing lake. It had that connotations a long time ago, and then when the Catholics moved in, they kind of put then their Catholic persona on that. But you can see what I say. It's interesting in that the Pope chose a place with a Catholic persona to come to apologize about the residential schools. That was kind of ironic. But on the other hand, a lot of natives who are Catholic consider this to be a sacred place. You could say water in itself is always considered sacred, but in this, people take pilgrimages here to try to heal their physical problems. And at one point then, this fellow here on the right gave the Pope a headdress, put this headdress on him. And it was a bit controversial. Some people are saying, why are you giving the Pope, who was responsible for this this tragedy, this sacred object, bestowing these feathers on him? In the old days, you had to earn them through respect and through courage. But for him, that was part of his healing. This is what they did to kind of bring it back together. And we see here then the Pope then kissing his hand. I talk about a kind of a switch in power play. But the Pope had some significant things to say at that particular meeting. But he wasn't the only one. Look at this. Back in 2010, Pope Benedict was already raising the issue about how the priests were beginning to harm young people and turning their God's concern, he said, in the very opposite direction. So they acknowledged, 12 years ago, that there's something seriously wrong with the way things were conducted. When Pope Francis was elected, it's a big issue because he's from the Americas. He's one of the first non-European popes to be installed there. And he asks that the church become more aware of the errors and abuses that they committed. Well, the TRC certainly did that, volumes and volumes of information on that. But he said he also wanted to try to stop that from happening in the future. Last year, he said that as the discovery of the children's bodies was found, that he was expressing this closeness to the Canadian people traumatized by the shocking news. Well, the trauma wasn't the news. The trauma is what the Catholic people did that put those kids in the grave to begin with. That was the trauma. And I don't think they've ever adequately addressed that. But he was encouraging to saying that, colonization still exists. There's a certain mentality we got to work at, we got to overcome. And I think that a lot of our people were encouraged by the visit. But Senator Murray Sinclair, who was the head of the TRC commission, he just was a little disappointed. He says the apology, failed to take into account that the church itself didn't live up to its own standards. And, that allowed them to perpetuate this, not only with Indigenous people here, but all over the world. And so that still is a big matter. The apology is not enough, but we need to see elemental changes in attitude and beliefs that are going to get past that colonial legacy. Earlier, there was another pope that came, 1984, Pope John Paul II. And he visited several different communities. He actually went to South and Central America too, trying to heal the relationship between the church and the indigenous people. And as we see him emerging from this tent out in the Northwest Territories, but he said something very interesting, very intriguing, very kind of infuriating to me. He said, when the faith was first preached to the native people, the worthy traditions of the Indian tribes were strengthened and enriched by the gospel's message. Your forefathers, meaning my forefathers, knew by instinct that the gospel, far from destroying their authentic values and customs, had the power to purify and uplift the cultural heritage which they had received. Yeah, that was a little difficult for me to understand that what he's saying, but then this last thing. Thus, not only is Christianity relevant to the Indian peoples, but Christ, in the members of his body, is himself Indian. Totally ignoring what actually took place there in the residential schools. I think that statement came as quite a surprise to those who were forced to pray and forced to adopt the Catholic point of view. So was the Pope that ill-informed, or was the church that mistaken about what they were actually doing to our children? But the Pope actually survived an assassination attempt, and our people, having empathy, did a ceremony for him. So when he came to the Shrine of the Martyrs in 1987, this Mohawk man, Ernie Benedict, performed a ceremony and gave him the eagle feather because he earned his feather by being wounded trying to spread peace. It's an interesting concept. But the Pope then said, now think about this, 1987, the cultural oppression, the injustices, the disruption of your life and your traditional societies must be acknowledged. That's what he was doing. Unfortunately, not all members of the church lived up to their Christian responsibilities. Now we are called to learn from the mistakes of the past, and we must work together for reconciliation and healing as brothers and sisters in Christ. Well, what happens if you don't believe in Christ? How do we work together on healing those wounds? But my point here is looking at this call has been within the Catholic Church, acknowledging this has been here for quite a while. So now that we're in 2022, we should be a little bit farther down that reconciliation path than maybe we are. One thing that keeps dragging us back are stereotypes. Look at this picture of Joseph Brant in the Mohawk Chapel in Brantford. He's wearing this big Western headdress, even though it's not part of our tradition. Well, look on the right, look who else is wearing a big headdress. Again, this kind of bestowing headdress upon political and religious figures kind of intrigues me, and it makes me wonder what's really going on here, and how much do they really believe that, or is it just all a photo op? Our own people adopted that big Western headdress. This is a protest about immigration rules that was restricting the ability of Haudenosaunee people born in Canada to go to work in the United States. This was Clinton Rickard from Tuscarora and other leaders from Grand River. So when you wore their big headdress, you always attracted the press. So let's just say it was their device in doing that. But guess who else wore a headdress? One time in 1919, Edward, who later became King Edward VIII, was given the title Chief Morning Star from some of our native nations out west. And the question is, so what really was that? Is it just a ceremonial adoption, or was there something really going on there? And then look at Prince Charles, 1977. He was given the name Red Crow, donning that headdress again and putting the red paint on his face and wearing that beaded shirt. And you wonder, is this just all for show? But when you hear Prince Charles' words when he was prince, maybe there's something else going on. So he said, they visited the country earlier this year, and he said it'd been deeply moving to have met the survivors of residential schools who, with such courage, have shared their experiences. On behalf of my wife and myself, I wanted to acknowledge their suffering and to say how much our hearts go out to them and their families. The Pope was the head of the Catholic Church that ran many of the residential schools, but the Queen, his mother, was the head of the church that ran many of the Anglican residential schools. So this was very interesting to me. These two things are happening at the same time. But the reality of this school, let's not forget that trauma that took place. In this case, look at these 4 young boys from 7 to 9, froze to death, and they ran away from a school in British Columbia. Most of the residential schools had to have a graveyard there to bury the students. How many kids died in your grade school or your high school? How many funerals did you go to of your fellow students? Well, this was the reality. And when you get that kind of reality, it changes your temperament. It affects the way you are. And I think that legacy is we're seeing that happens all across the country. And it hasn't ended, to tell you the truth. Many Native people still go to a boarding school or a residential school. There's one in Thunder Bay that's notorious now because of the number of students there who have died under mysterious circumstances, or the number of kids that have died in while in the care of the province. These are just some of the kids. And then our suicide rate is so high, 9 times the Afro national average. You got to say there's something deeply wrong that allows our young people to become so hopeless, so disconnected, so rootless that they'll take their own life. Again, back to Prince Charles, though. Said all leaders have shared with me the importance of reconciliation. Of course, he heard that very clearly. We must listen to the truth of lived experiences of Indigenous people, and we should work to understand better their pain and suffering. We all have a responsibility to listen, understand, and act in ways that foster relationships between us. This really is why we're here today. This is so now the king is saying the same kind of things that the government has said and that the Indigenous people have said. First, we got to hear the hard truth before we can get to the reconciliation. And I know for most of you, you didn't read the reports from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. To tell you the truth, I haven't read them all either. It's just volumes of stuff. And sometimes it's hard to get through. It's just, you can't believe the amount of evidence. It keeps adding up more and more and more. There's a certain kind of trauma that goes along with learning about historic trauma. But there it is. If you want to do something, that's what I would suggest you do. You just have to start reading these reports. I know that it takes time. They're all available online, but you have to empower yourself with knowledge. This is the closest you're going to get to talking to some of the survivors. Their testimony, their memory is going to help us understand why things are the way they are. And then also we may see in there, what can we do about all of this? How can we change that? And we have to change things because, to tell you the truth, that dire situation is getting worse. Look at these rates of poverty across Canada. So generally, they say poverty in children across Canada ranges from 11 to 17%. But for Indigenous children, look at this, 27 to 55% in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. If you look at the rates of incarceration in those same states, you'll realize that poverty is driving our people to do desperate things. And racism then does not give them an opportunity to fair justice. So how is it that the original people of this land, who were proud, self-sustaining people, have now become paupers in their own homeland? Well, that's a result of this, and it's something that we have to look at. It's not just about saying you're sorry, but how can we help build back the Indigenous infrastructure, Indigenous economy, so that people in distant communities can live a meaningful life. I used to work at a prison program in Attica Prison because there were a number of Native inmates there. And it's always a dilemma because it's true that some inmates are so desperate and so dangerous, you don't know what else to do with them. But as this fellow mentioned, if I don't have a drink every morning, I start freaking out, you know. That's because the trauma that took place, physical, mental, sexual, spiritual trauma, has not been resolved in many people. And then, like I mentioned, through lateral violence, it gets extended to others, or through inherited trauma, it gets extended to the children. Some of the survivors acknowledge that. I treated my kids poorly because I didn't know how you're supposed to treat kids. I didn't know how to express love. I didn't know how to be a good father. And so what people turn then to substance abuse to kind of numb themselves. So isn't it ironic that the #1 growth industry in Indigenous communities are now shops that sell marijuana? So, even though it could be legal, there's something to that when people have to turn to it. And all you're doing is numbing the pain. You're not addressing the root cause of it. I was born in 1950, and it just seems like my whole life, my people have been protesting about the land. The one on the left here shows a young boy protesting in 1977, save the land for us, the little guys. But these things have gone unaddressed. In fact, at Grand River, Well, we've been asking for financial land justification since 1797. Every generation gets worse, gets put off. And now our young people are so angry, they're not going to put up with any more, not one more inch of land, not one more lie, not one more delay. They want these matters resolved. And it gets more intense. Look at, there's nothing worse than burning tires for the environment and our young people out of desperation to attract attention. That's what happens at these protests. You would think in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we would move past this where the lawyers get together and try to explain why we can't do anything to where we sit down now and saying, yes, let's recognize that the nature of these land matters exist. Let's recognize the betrayal that took place. Let's recognize the violation of the treaty, but then let's move forward from that. So we need a whole nother truth and reconciliation attitude just to the land matters alone, because that's the place we're talking about. That's what connects people to that. And our people aren't sitting idly by, are working very hard. We've got groups all over the place, and then our allies are also working with us to try to turn the TRC call to action into a real work plan, a real life plan, a real way to build alliances. And so this is why then coming together to protect the water, to protect the air, to protect the vitality of the land is very important. But our connection to nature then is also important. This is a painting I did to talk about our clan mother. It connects our people to, we have 9 different family clans. This is a cradle board I made for my own children. It talks about our connection to the earth as the turtle, and the families are represented by the bluebirds. So these aren't just artifacts or tourist objects, but it talks about a philosophy, a connection to nature. So earth-based education or being on the land is very important to our people, because when you're in the garden, when you're in the forest, when you're on the water, it's a different kind of thing than sitting in a classroom. And the reason why classroom education doesn't work for us very well is that it just doesn't deal with that reality of their world. The things that we give thanks for, a lot of them can't be found in the classroom. They're out there in the landscape. So reconnecting to nature. And then you see the strawberries there because that's our symbol of our first medicine. I just put that all into to say, what kind of future is that? So the clan mother is a little pensive, wondering, what kind of world is this baby going to grow up in? My wife, Janet Miracle, and I were some of the founding members of a school at Six Nations to restore the fluency of the Mohawk language. So immersion schools have become very important in all of our communities, because you're trying to recover the very thing that the Mohawk Institute tried to take away. And so that's difficult, though, because people like me, I grew up speaking and thinking and envisioning in the English language. To try to do that in a native language takes a whole different mindset. So working through all of that. In this case here, you can see one of the students presenting a lesson to Mark Miller, the Minister for Indigenous Relations, who himself has learned how to speak Mohawk. So our future is going to rest between that and being able to arm ourselves with the kind of skills necessary to face the real situations in our lives. To do that, some of our communities have gone back to the rites of passage here among the Mohawks. How do we help our young people get connected to find a meaningful place within their society? So you think we're all on this journey of life from birth to death. Our culture used to be moments along that way to reinforce that identity. Well, what they're finding was one of the best ways of doing that is reconnecting to food. As you can see here, our ancestral corn, that great gift from nature to us. So getting people back in the garden, learning the language about all of that, learning the ceremonies of doing that, and learning about their roles and responsibilities, about the men and women to food, to family, to community. That's an important part of our revitalization. And getting people dancing again, as simple as it sounds, but it's important. And that dance is very ancient, connects you to what I call this vibrational energy of the earth, of our ancestors in the ground. When you beat that drum, you're literally dancing in harmony with the heartbeat of the earth. And there's something happens to our people when they dance. You ought to see that it's just joyfulness, the recovering of this happiness of being Indigenous and celebrating that. with others. So it's an important part of the connection. But we have to also go beyond the dance. It's not just about, performing or powwowing. This really is expressing yourself and your thankfulness through dance. In the 1820s, we didn't have much economic options, after the War of 1812, but our women began to go to Niagara Falls to sell beadwork. As we can see, the one on the left from Niagara Falls is actually a needle case. But it started off a whole cultural industry and also a form of expression. So on the right, we see a contemporary pincushion made by Grant Jonathan from Tuscarora. Who would believe that little tiny bead could lead to a reformation of your identity, add to your artistic heritage, and find a new way to express yourself? Even though it was made for sale to the visitor, it manifests some deep-seated beliefs about our connection to place. So it's important to our people since maybe since the 1930s, to recover those craft processes, art, craft, whatever you want to call it, learning how to make things that your ancestors made by learning why they made them and how they use them. And it's not all just for sale to a tourist or to the craft shop. So they're recovering the functionality of things made by hand. That connects you not only to the material, but to your traditions and to your ancestors, and it also connects you to the future. Art is a legacy for the future to help people understand what your beliefs, your identity, and your values are. At the same time, I grew up in a family of ironworkers. It was another tradition among our people. It started by 1850. So while the women are selling beadwork at Niagara Falls, the men are building bridges that cross the Niagara River. All of the big bridges, all of the big buildings built in North America, there was Haudenosaunee ironworkers there. So in this particular case, we see these two men, one from Grand River, one from New York, two Haudenosaunee men, at the last beams that were put into place at the Rainbow Bridge. So it's just ironic they're carrying an American and a Canadian flag, but it symbolizes that our men are building the infrastructure that made both the United States and Canada great. So now's the time for the Canadians and Americans to help us build our cultural infrastructure so that our communities can thrive again. One important tool in that has been lacrosse. We've been playing lacrosse all along. It's a very traditional game, but now it's becoming an avenue for the future. On the left, you see the Team Iroquois. They actually played in the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis. Today, our team, the Haudenosaunee Nationals, are trying to get into the Olympics that are coming up in Los Angeles in 2028 to play lacrosse, competing against the world. The game itself is getting a wide audience, both among young men and young women. So who'd ever thought that the old game that we played would become one of the fastest growing sports in the world? There are now like 74 countries all around the world playing lacrosse, and they all honor its roots with the Haudenosaunee. But because we aren't recognized by a nation, by the United Nations, getting into the Olympics is not an automatic thing. We've got a lot of hard work to do to get there. But if we do, it proves our sovereignty, our nationality, our tradition, and it is what will manifest the intention of not only the TRC, but I believe the rights of Indigenous people that was made in the Declaration of the UN. This is what nationhood is about, is carrying your game forward under your flag. I found this online, was kind of interesting to me. My Mohawk clan mother, her advice to lacrosse player: if you're going to be a goalie, to offer your stick in the 4 directions. In other words, you're honoring that and you're asking creation to join you. But then she says, but don't back down and don't show any mercy. And I'm not quite sure what she meant by that, but let's just say for our young people, our young boys and our young girls who are now embracing lacrosse, when they walk onto the field or into the box, they carry such great pride and tradition and connection. It's very important to their identity. And it's not just the Haudenosaunee, as we see here for this young guy from Walpole Island. Lacrosse has become the new connection for our people. We also are recovering our tradition of law. Now, we've always had a council of chiefs and clan mothers. They've always been governing our communities. But since we recovered the wampum belts from our museums, there's the symbols of our government. We're able to read their message again. And for the last decade, we've been going around to our communities to recite what this great law of peace is all about. how it's meant to govern our people. And it's really helping to lead to a new way of thinking about that. It's a very ancient tradition that we have here, and these men have been very instrumental in passing that on to the next generation. And our next generation wants to stand up and do more, just like those that are protesting. There's also those here. These are some young Mohawks who went to a session at the United Nations. We travel on our own passport here. It's not always easy, but it's a very important part of our identity and nationality. So our connection to place is represented there because it has your nation where you come from, but our place then becomes wherever we are. So we represent the Haudenosaunee, whether at the UN or over in Geneva, or we're playing lacrosse in California, or visiting the White House in DC. It's all of our place because we represent that great tradition. And it's happening all over the Indigenous world, especially these matters now about murdered and missing Indigenous women. The awareness of that has traveled all across the hemisphere. And Native people from Argentina all the way to Iceland are standing up and saying that we are still here. We still want to be ourselves. We want to work in collaboration with our neighbors, but we're not going to, it's not the old days that things have changed. They're not going to be able to treat us the way we got treated in the past. And that identity and that belief and that power that comes when we put our strengths together, it's an amazing thing to see. That's why this day is important, because it represents this, not just this healing, but many people are coming out. Many of our own people, well, maybe they were sitting on the sidelines all this time. They want to get involved. This every child matter has brought all of our people together. And now in schools all across the country and universities and cities, everybody's taking time to think about that. What happened to the Indigenous people? What happened to us as the perpetrators of these crimes against Indigenous people? And what are we going to do about all of this stuff here? And this unity is just, all I can tell you is it's gaining momentum. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're going to see more and more of that. But it's got to go beyond the parade, beyond the procession, beyond the expressions of gratitude. We got to get now to actually working at what is the nature of that relationship going to be. But as I was putting this together, I started thinking about Niagara Falls itself. It's a powerful, sacred place to our people, both us, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. We both believe that powerful thunder beings lived here at one time, and they still have an impact on our world. And that's important to remember. So our story is that the thunder beings live behind Niagara Falls. There was a woman who was going to commit suicide going over the falls. They reached out and grabbed her. They performed this medicine. They found out she had this huge snake inside of her, and they cured her. But the thunder beings are the ones then that shoot their lightning bolts down to chase away those serpents, which are a metaphor for the harm that could cause to humans. So think about that. You know, we are dependent upon that thunder and that lightning because there's something underground, there's something danger that still stalks us. We need their help to do that. They say the thunder beings left Niagara Falls when too many tourists show up. So I don't know about that, but you're not going to see them down there, but you're still going to see their arrows come flying as lightning now and then. So let's hope that you've done well, because otherwise they may be aiming them at you. But the Niagara Power Project went through. It was a big controversy at Tuscarora, where my mother is from and where I live, because the Power Project took part of our reservation, or part of our nation territory, as we can see here. But the ironic thing, again, going back to what the king said and what the Pope said, the state argued that it would be a waste of a natural resource not to build this reservoir. And they thought they provided us with just compensation. But as you can see here, a woman who's crying because she had to leave her childhood home and watch it being destroyed, and that land where she played was now covered up by water. Those wounds don't go away very easy. How do you provide just compensation for that? And the dislocation of Indigenous people that continues today causes some profound impact on us. Now back to the king now for one last thing. We simply must learn practical lessons of the traditional knowledge through deep connections to the land and water. about how we should treat this planet, and above all, recognize the vital importance of taking into account the seventh unborn generation. I couldn't have written that speech better for the king if they had let me. But we see this convergence of thought. It's what our ancestors always said. This is what our people at universities say. This is what people in our communities say. This is what we advocate for. And now finally we have somebody who represents the crown saying the same thing. What we're taught is you look to the ground, to the faces, you see the faces of the coming generation, and that they're there. Those kids are coming up. They're looking to us to make sure that they're going to be born into a world that's healthy and safe. So we have to think about that, like the king said, because the real issue that we're faced with is this place going to survive? No matter how you're rooted in it, no matter how much corn you plant, how many times you dance, is the physicality of this place going to survive? And those of us that live around the Great Lakes and the Niagara River, where now there are fish advisories in just about every river, creek, lake, or water because of the contaminants there. So not only are young people looking at it, but our ancestors are looking at us. And we have to think about that ourselves and maybe get past our polemics of politics and to say, how can we bring our minds together now to improve our relationship with the earth? And when we do that in partnership, we become even stronger allies. Anyway, those are the kind of things I was thinking about as I was asked to share with you some ideas for today. And I think we're going to have some time for a few questions. And so I'll turn that back to our moderators.
All right. Thank you, Rick. Again, as always, we learn so much from your knowledge and your understanding and your perspective on these issues. And we love that you always bring it back to Niagara Falls, because certainly you have a connection to this space and an understanding of what it means to you and your people. So the questions, the Q&A section is open for people if they want to sort of put a question in there. We've had one in there already. I'm going to sort of start it off maybe with a big one. I think you talk so much about sense of place, and again, for us in Niagara Falls, right? Niagara Falls has such a sense of place, and you show Haudenosaunee and other places that have such iconic sense of places. You talked about the Mohawk Institute a lot as well, and that's certainly a sense of place. I'm trying to remember where I was going to, which is such a very colonial symbol and such a powerful meaning symbol. Right in the heart of the community there. Do you see the fact that the community wanted to keep the Mohawk Institute up, that they didn't want to knock it down like many other institutions? Is that a bit of that community sort of saying, hey, this is a sense of place, but we will resurrect it, we will do something with it? Is that a similarity to the Pope kissing the chief's hand? Is that the idea that there's an empowerment in keeping that up? Is that sort of where that community sort of saw keeping such a colonial symbol still standing?
Yes, it was quite dramatic when they asked the community, what do you want to do with this place? Well, we were already operating a cultural center there since the 70s. But the reason why they developed the Save the Evidence campaign was just that fact. It's a place of trauma. We need to understand the trauma, because that trauma impacts on our society, both of our societies today. And so we need a place that can be a window to that trauma, but also a mirror upon which we reflect of what are we going to do about that trauma? But I think, Clark, we got to remember too, that there's two kinds of trauma. That what happens to us, and that how you want to say it, rests within the hearts and minds of the perpetrators, the Canadians. It's not just a matter of church and government, but we're at a really historic moment where we could change the course of what it means to be Canadian through this kind of collaboration. So I think that's what they're looking for. It's a place now where we can reflect on it, not just to harp about the trauma that took place, but now use it as a place of healing and then a springboard to a future.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, and for understand, I spoke to Tim Johnson this week. I know there's an interpretive plan going, so things are moving quite well. That it looks like it's moving forward, and hopefully in the near future it'll be a place where a lot of people can go and understand that story with an even deeper meaning. With again, people can travel to it and have that sense of place as well. So it's great that it is moving forward. I've got a few questions in our Q&A section. One is about, in some ways, about symbols and symbolism. And the question is about Indigenous flags and what is appropriate at local ceremonies for people to be flying. And I guess I think there's probably a multitude of answers on that one, but maybe I'll let you take that, Rick.
Yeah, half of me feels like we'd be better off with no flags at all, because that just gets us into a whole lot of dilemma. But when we formed the Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team, and now the Haudenosaunee Nationals, competing in tournaments around the world, that all sports start with a acknowledgement of the flag. So they asked us, do you have a flag? And I was on the board of the Nationals, and my friend Oren Lyons was also there. He said, well, of course we do. Well, we didn't have one, but we went and made one. So we took that old wampum belt that shows the unity of our nations and turned that into our flag. And, you know, I used to always have a dilemma. Say you go to a hockey game and they sing the American anthem and the Canadian anthem, but because of what happened to our people, we didn't always stand for that. We didn't always acknowledge that. Even though my dad was a combat veteran, there was always something, an awkward moment. But then I was on the field when they raised the Haudenosaunee flag for the first time, along with the American flag and the British flag and the Canadian flag and all of the Australian flag. And everybody stood there in honor of us as the originators of the game. So the flag took on a new kind of symbolism. It was a way of relating to us. So I'm kind of a firm believer in it. Now the Haudenosaunee, we're in a unique position. We may be the oldest surviving Indigenous government in North America. We don't get our power from the Department of Indian Affairs. We're not a band government or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're still an independent nation. So that flag is true. But a lot of our other communities have flags. And so what I'm saying, yeah, out of respect for the Indigenous communities within your within walking distance, meaning a day's walk from your area, or maybe even a day's car ride, yes, you might want to ask them if they would share their flag with you. I think it's just part of this learning that could be helpful to all of us.
Thanks. Another really, again, in this geopolitical era, is in this time where things are, for lack of better terms, complicated. The question we have is, could you talk about the idea of the Crown's current relationship with honoring treaties and empowering Indigenous culture and life? I understand that the King of England has to be apolitical, and so this is a little bit confusing in this era.
And I'm even more confused. My wife and I watched the TV series The Crown. Okay, we know it's Hollywood, but a repeated theme through that was that the crown is just the physical crown. It's this ancient office, this royal family, and they persist at continuing that, but it has no authority over the governance of Britain, and therefore has no authority over the colonies, other than to declare that the Queen, or now the King of Canada and all of this country. So I'm a little perplexed right now. And then when I saw the funeral and now the installation coming up, it's time to ask that. What is the crown when it comes to Canada? Who is the crown? And what relationship can we have with them? We have been petitioning Queen Elizabeth II ever since she got in office to pay attention to these treaty matters. In 2010, she came to Toronto and she gave these silver bells to the Mohawk Chapel. And on the bells was inscribed 1710 to 2010, the Silver Covenant Chain. She was referencing when what they called the 4 Indian kings went to meet with Queen Anne, 1710. Now here she is, a female queen. And she said, I'm giving these in recognition of our treaty relationship to the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations. But ironically, that same year, England denied entry of our lacrosse team to play in international games because we're carrying our own passport. So apparently the Queen didn't talk to the immigration people about this. And so we have this ceremonial relationship, but where do we get down to the profound political, economic, military alliance that the covenant chain really represented in the past? So it is a very interesting question. How are we going to move this forward? I believe Canadians have to ask that same question of your leaders. How is the crown now going to be manifested in a constructive way? Everything was done in the name of the crown. The treaties were made that way. So there's obviously an obligation from there, but it's so easy now. It's going to be that King George can just say, I can't interfere politically. And a lot of those things he said that he was quoted, who knows if he's going to be able to continue that. He hinted he's going to pass that on to his son. So it'll be interesting. But yeah, I got the same question. If we have a crown matter, who are we supposed to talk to?
Mhm.
King Charles, the Prime Minister, Parliament in England? Who is it that we're supposed to deal with? So maybe you could help us on that. Who is your crown?
I guess on that follow-up though, is there hope that the new Governor General can help with that transition? Is that the hope in the community, I assume?
Well, exasperating.
Maybe you don't want to go there. Maybe you don't. Want to go
Well,
there.
exasperatingly, we always have hope
Mhm.
year after year, generation after generation. We always hope that yes, it will come true. That yes, the crown will manifest its relationship. So yeah, there's that hope. But to tell you the truth, she hasn't contacted us yet.
Right.
So we'll see. We'll see what happens next on that matter. But I
Yeah.
can tell you, there's a lot of people who sincerely are sincerely attached to the crown who want to see goodness come out of that. So maybe this moment, this historical moment, but not only the TRC with a new king who has said those things, maybe now is the time we can begin to explore what that really means.
Yes. Okay, I'm going to end it there. We don't have any other questions in the queue, and certainly we've taken up a lot of your time, Rick, and again, always really appreciate it. The other question we did have in, this has been recorded. We will post to our YouTube channel as quickly as possible. And much like locals, Rick, I think the Thunder Beings may just not go east of Stanley now that the tourists have come in here. That's sort of, locally, we don't tend to go down into that area. So maybe that's where the Thunder Beings are. But anyways, my attempt at humor. Rick, again, it's always been a pleasure to have you present to the community here and do what share your knowledge and provide us some perspective and understanding, and we really appreciate it. And these stories are history, but Rick always shows us how this impacts the now. We've got a very vibrant Indigenous community here. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the NRNC is actually hosting their powwow tomorrow in St. Catharines, and you can see the vibrancy of the community. Following this day of grief, tomorrow will be a celebration of the culture. So I would encourage people to sort of check that out as well. And I encourage everyone to continue learning about and from the Indigenous community, to ask questions. There's so many lessons we can take from listening to Thanksgiving addresses to looking at how the Four Directions can provide us strength, and recognizing that the type of clay we are is important and we must protect this. So I encourage you to keep an eye for other programs, ones we do and other institutions do, events that we have in the museums coming up. So follow our social media, subscribe to our e-newsletter. And us at the Niagara Falls Museums, again, one more time, want to thank Rick for sharing his knowledge with us. And we hope all of you that followed along, hope you learned something and have a deeper understanding of the reason to mark this day and can join us in the future. And go away thinking about what you can do about the lessons from today. So from the team here at the Niagara Falls Museums and the Culture Division, we want to thank you for joining us and have a great day. Take care.
So long.
Bye-bye.